Okay, so have you ever thought about how wildly different it's been throughout history and across cultures, the way people raise kids?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, you just have to look back a bit and you see these totally different ideas about what it means to be a parent, or even what a child is.
It's true, right? Like in ancient Mesopotamia, you had the Code of Hammurabi basically spelling it all out, right? Like
Okay.
parental responsibility carved in stone.
Yeah, and then in ancient Greece and Rome, it was all about these philosophers, debating what the ideal education for kids should be, like a totally different vibe.
And then there's ancient China with Confucianism, like weaving this huge respect for elders and parents into their whole society. It's mind-blowing.
It really makes you think about like what we consider normal today, right?
Right.
Like where did those ideas come from and why do we just accept them?
It's such a good point.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads us to what we're digging into today, this fascinating shift in how children are cared for. We're going to be looking specifically at the Xhosa tradition of communal care in South Africa and how it's kind of bumping up against these modern legal frameworks. It's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, it's a really powerful example of how you have this very old, deeply rooted cultural way of doing things, and then this legal system that is often based on very different um, Western ideas about family and parenting.
Exactly. So in the Xhosa tradition, it wasn't just mom and dad who were responsible for the kids.
Right.
It was really this collective effort where kids were seen as belonging to the whole community.
Right, family, extended family, neighbors, everyone had a role to play. It's this amazing idea of shared responsibility built right into their culture.
And there's this core concept of Ubuntu, right,
Mhm.
that I think is really important to understand in this whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Ubuntu is all about interconnectedness. And that idea of shared responsibility we were talking about, it basically reflects this worldview where the individual is always linked to the community.
So it's not just about individual rights, but about how everyone is responsible for each other in a way.
Exactly. And that's a really stark contrast to some of those Western legal frameworks that prioritize the nuclear family and the authority of the individual parent.
Right. You can see how those two ideas might clash a bit.
Oh, for sure. And historically, when those Western legal frameworks kind of arrived, often alongside colonialism, they really shook things up. They often ended up undermining these existing social structures and traditions that had been around for centuries.
It wasn't just an exchange of ideas or a friendly debate. It was often a very forceful imposition of a different way of thinking about family and children.
Okay, so to really understand where those Western frameworks are coming from, we kind of need to go back to the Enlightenment era, right? Like that was a total game changer in terms of how people viewed the world and children. Totally. I mean, you had thinkers like John Locke coming up with this idea of tabula rasa, that kids are born as these blank slates and that their experiences shape who they become.
Which was revolutionary at the time, right? Because it meant that children weren't seen as just many adults or, inherently bad or whatever. It put a lot of emphasis on the importance of education and their environment.
Yeah, it was this big shift towards seeing children as having potential and needing nurturing and protection. You can see the seeds of modern child rights ideas starting to sprout there.
And then you had Rousseau, who was all about this child-centered approach to education,
Hmm.
letting kids learn at their own pace, following their natural curiosity, instead of just forcing them into these rigid structures.
These were big ideas that, even though they weren't perfect or universal, really helped to change how people thought about children and their rights.
For sure. But then fast forward a bit to the Industrial Revolution, and it's like a total reality check, right? All these fancy ideas about respecting children's rights kind of went out the window.
Yeah, I mean, it's just horrific to think about kids as young as 3 or 4 being forced into these dangerous jobs, like chimney sweeps, for example. It's just awful.
And the health risks were crazy, right? I mean, kids were getting all sorts of respiratory problems. They were getting injured and sometimes even dying.
Hmm.
It's a terrible time for children.
It really exposes the gap between, ideals and reality, but it also sparked a lot of activism and reform movements.
Right? It's like this huge wake-up call that something had to change.
Yeah.
People started fighting for basic protections for children, and that eventually led to the first child labor laws.
It was a slow process, but it marked a really important shift towards recognizing that children are vulnerable and deserve special consideration and protection.
And that kind of paved the way for more formal recognition of children's rights on a global scale.
Exactly. I mean, in 1924, you had the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which was the first international document to really spell out that children have specific rights that need to be respected. It was a huge step.
And then after World War II, when the world saw just how vulnerable children were during conflicts, the UN came out with the Declaration of the Rights of the Child in 1959. And this one was really important because it said very clearly that a child's best interest should always be the top priority.
That was a game changer because it shifted the focus away from parental rights or societal convenience and put the spotlight directly on the well-being of the child.
So now let's bring this all back to South Africa.
Yeah.
So post-apartheid, post-1994, there's this huge push for transformation, right? And the new constitution becomes this symbol of hope and progress.
Absolutely. The 1994 Constitution is a really remarkable document, and it very clearly enshrines the best interests of the child in Section 28. It's a fundamental principle that has to be considered in all matters relating to children.
It's not just a suggestion, it's the law.
Right, exactly. And it's not just about best interests either. Section 9 of the Constitution also guarantees equality before the law and prohibits unfair discrimination. So you have these two really powerful principles working together to try and create a truly fair and just system for children.
But as we've been talking about, there's this tension, right, between these Western legal frameworks and the more traditional ex-hosa approach to child rearing.
Right. The ex-hosa tradition sees children as belonging to the community with shared responsibility for their upbringing, while many Western legal systems, particularly historically, have tended to focus on the nuclear family and the authority of individual parents.
And often the mother, right? Like, historically, there's been this assumption that the mother is the primary caregiver.
Yeah, and that leads us to this really problematic issue of maternal preference bias. Even in legal systems that are supposed to be gender neutral, you often see this tendency to favor mothers over fathers in custody disputes.
And that bias is usually based on these outdated stereotypes, right? Like the idea that mothers are just naturally better at caring for children.
Exactly. It's like this unspoken assumption that puts a much heavier burden on fathers to prove they're competent parents, while mothers are often given the benefit of the doubt.
Which doesn't seem very fair or in line with the whole equality thing we were talking about.
Not at all. It's like this relic of a time when women were primarily seen as homemakers and men as breadwinners. It just doesn't reflect the reality of modern families anymore.
And it's kind of a paradox, right? Because on the surface, it might seem like this bias is helping mothers, but it's actually reinforcing these really harmful gender stereotypes that can limit women's choices and opportunities.
Totally. It can trap women in these traditional caregiving roles instead of recognizing them as individuals with equal rights to pursue careers or other interests outside of motherhood.
So even though South Africa has this very progressive constitution, the sources we've looked at suggest that in practice, children's courts are still often applying this maternal preference rule. So how does that actually play out?
Despite the Constitution and all the legal reforms, fathers often face an uphill battle in custody cases. They're often held to a different standard than mothers and have to work harder to prove they're capable parents.
Like with those mandatory family advocate inquiries we read about.
Yeah, there's concern that those inquiries, well intended to be neutral, are sometimes applied more heavily to fathers than to mothers. There's also this lingering idea of the tender years doctrine, which basically says that very young children are always better off with their mothers.
So it's like fathers are starting off at a disadvantage simply because they're men.
That's unfortunately the case for many fathers in South Africa. The legal system hasn't fully caught up with the Constitution's commitment to equality.
And what are the real-world consequences of all of this? It can't just be about the parents involved, right?
The biggest impact is obviously on the children. They can miss out on the benefits of having both parents actively involved in their lives. And in some cases, it can even lead to more trauma down the line. Like imagine if a child grows up primarily with their mother and then something happens to her. The child then has to suddenly adjust to living with a parent and an extended family that they barely know.
That's heartbreaking to think about.
It can also be incredibly damaging for fathers who are unjustly denied the chance to have close relationships with their kids. It can lead to a lot of emotional distress and financial burdens as they fight for their rights.
And it affects the whole family, right? Like grandparents and aunts and uncles on the father's side. They're also denied that opportunity to bond with the child.
It's true. It can really fracture families and perpetuate these harmful gender roles that hurt everyone.
So what about some of the arguments that people use to try and justify this maternal preference, like the breastfeeding argument, for example? How does that hold up?
Well, the idea is that because mothers breastfeed, they should automatically be the primary caregivers, especially in the early months. But that ignores the reality that many mothers go back to work and express breast milk. So if the concern is really just about feeding the baby, why couldn't a father do that just as well?
That makes sense. And we know that fathers are perfectly capable of caring for young children, especially in situations where the mother might not be able to be. There's no evidence that mothers are just magically better at it.
And fathers often have their own support networks, right? Like their mothers and sisters who can help out. It's not like they're doing it all alone.
So if these justifications don't really work, where does the South African Constitution stand on all of this?
The Constitution is very clear. The maternal preference rule goes against the Equality Clause and the principle of non-discrimination. Since 1994, there's been this presumption in South African law that both parents have equal rights and responsibilities towards their child. And any deviation from that has to be justified based on the best interests of the child.
So it's not about automatically favoring one parent over the other. It's about what's best for the child in each individual case.
Exactly. And the burden of proof should be on the person who's trying to limit the other parent's involvement. They have to show that it's truly in the child's best interests.
And what about the role of the High Court? We read that they're the upper guardian of all children, but some people are saying they haven't done enough to address this bias in the lower courts.
There's been a lot of criticism that the High Court hasn't really tackled these discriminatory practices head on, and that by not stepping in more forcefully, they've allowed these biases to kind of linger in the system.
And the fact that a lot of these court proceedings happen behind closed doors doesn't help, right? It makes it harder to know what's going on and hold people accountable.
Transparency is really important in these cases. While privacy is important too, having more open proceedings could help to expose biases and ensure that decisions are truly being made in the best interests of the child.
So at the end of the day, what should be the guiding principle in all of these custody cases?
It always has to come back to the best interests of the child. Every decision should be based on a thorough assessment of each parent's ability to provide a stable and loving environment for the child. And that assessment shouldn't rely on gender stereotypes or outdated assumptions.
It really seems like South Africa has a long way to go to fully realize the promise of equality that's written into its constitution.
It's going to take a real change in mindset, not just in legal system, but in society as a whole. We need to move beyond these old ideas about what it means to be a good mother or a good father and start focusing on the individual needs of each child and each family.
And for anyone who wants to dig deeper into this issue, the resources we used for this deep dive included some really interesting reports from UNICEF and discussions from the South African Law Reform Commission. We'll be sure to include links to those in the show notes.
It's definitely worth looking into. These issues affect so many families, and understanding them is crucial to building a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great discussion.
Absolutely.